All right, everybody, welcome back to Bio Bros Episode 2, our first real episode. This one is going to be about our top three favorite reptiles. As usual, I'm Shaw. I got my other co-host here, Alex,
Heyo.
and we have a guest today. We have Harrison. He's going to be kind of one of our permanent guests, so to speak. He's going to be on a lot of episodes. He's going to be kind of a mediator, prodding at questions and stuff, a little bit of a devil's advocate in this one, keep us honest. So, Harrison, any quick introduction you want to do for yourself?
Uh, sure. Yeah, I'm 26. I'm not a bio student like them, but I was a bio student and I dropped out. I'm the director of horticulture at a plant store, so I do more plant stuff than animal stuff. But I've still been keeping things for a very long time as well. But yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, we're happy to have you here, man. Uh, like I said, just keep prodding us on questions and all that throughout the show and kind of make sure that we're staying honest and we're not using our own bias in our top three. It's actually a pretty representative list of what the top three are. So, Alex, you want to kick us off with your first one?
Yeah, so my first of the top three beginner reptiles, I'm gonna cheat and instantly go for an amphibian. Um it's gonna be white tree frogs or I'm gonna butcher these scientific names, just a heads up. But Litoria parvulia. But they are
Close
just
enough.
yeah,
I think we know what you're talking
I'm
about.
gonna murder these, and it only gets worse. That was the easy of the scientific names that I have. Um, but they are like one of the most basic tree frogs. They're also one of the most hannibal amphibians in the hobby. So, like
That's a good
basic
one.
care, they just like temps from between 82 and 84. For like a basking area because they do enjoy a little spot that gets a little bit warmer. General temps just 74 to 76. They like normal household humidity, a little bit higher, like 50% with spikes. And then they mostly feed on just insects, basically anything that can fit in their mouth, including your fingers sometimes. Shaw, what's your first one?
All right, so for me, my first one, and just so you know, guys, these aren't in any particular order. I want to preface that one. They're some are going to be better for each individual person. This is just a top three. You can put them anywhere in the podium you want. A little bit of
Mhm.
personal preference. My very first one, I'm going to go with Chorophilus ciliatus, the crested gecko. Uh, I love them. This is a little bit of my bias showing. They're probably my favorite pet lizard to have. They come from New Caledonia and they are ultra easy to keep. They're quite small. They don't maybe 4 inches without their tail, and they're frugivores, so they actually eat fruit mostly in their diet. And there's tons of prepared diets, super super easy for feeding. That is a non-issue with them. Heating too, they don't really need heat or light in most areas. I'd say keep your house temperatures pretty normal. They'll be fine. Obviously, do your own research, take your own temperatures and stuff, make sure everything is okay as well. Um, but they're very handleable as well. They're super easy to hold. I've never seen one draw blood. They can bite, they do have mouths. They don't very often, but even when they do, it's not a big deal. But we do have a couple cons with them, and the biggest one for me is the tail. When they drop their tail, it does not regrow. So if you were to stress out the animal in some way and it drops its tail, you are stuck with a lizard that does not have a tail. That's okay, it won't harm them, but it is a thing. So especially if you're getting this reptile for a younger kid or a younger kid yourself and don't have a ton of confidence in handling reptiles calmly and all that yet, that is a potential concern. The other thing is humidity. They do need to have higher humidity, and it can be a little tricky to get that humidity range where it's not total swamp, but it's not arid either. Because if it gets too dry, they will have issues sticking to glass. Their sticky pads stop working in lower humidity, and higher humidity, you can run into respiratory issues. So it is a potential issue. Then again, mist them once a day in the morning or before you go to bed, just one time a day with a little cheap pressure mister, and you'll be good for the most part. Any other questions you guys have on that one?
Um, trying to think.
Thoughts or
Um,
concerns?
they're one of the really cool things about them is they're ciliatus, meaning like eyelash. So they call them the crested geckos when in reality they should be called the eyelash geckos because they do have those big prominent eyelashes. Um, but they're a cool species. I've got one myself. There's a lot of misinformation that I've found about temperature stuff. Like everybody wants to leave them in cooler temperatures, but they get super lethargic anywhere below like 70. And everyone says they'll die at like 78, but it routinely gets up to the 90s. Not that it's 90s where they're staying, but it's weird. It's a lot of
Yeah,
misinformation about that species.
I've definitely noticed that one too. Like people do believe that they want to be colder for some reason. Uh, I think where that probably comes from is the household temperatures thing. Like where I
Mhm.
live in Arizona, my household temperature is like that. Like in the winters, yeah, it's a little cooler, but in the summers, it will touch those mid 80s potentially in some areas of the house, and or especially inside of the tanks. So it's for me, that is household temperatures. For somebody in up north, that's not household temperatures, and you definitely might need to add that heat. That was a good point you brought up.
Right. Yeah, I've had them be super, super lethargic and anywhere, but like I used to keep them in a room that had big glass doors, so the temperature would fluctuate a good bit, and it stayed low 70s and high 60s, and it was not good for them. I had to add heat pretty quickly. I was worried about that little dude.
Yeah, that was a good point. I'm glad you brought that one up too, because it's hard for like every so often, you get not stuck in your own ways, but we all live in different climates, and sometimes your climate is really, really good for some animals, and other times it's bad. So when people say like household temperatures, they don't necessarily mean your household temperature.
Hmm.
Yeah, I was
Absolutely.
glad you brought that one up. Right, and want to move on to number two, or you want any other thoughts here for
I was just gonna
both
say
number
one thing
ones?
that's like
Yeah,
super
hit
cool
it.
about them is the fact that they were thought to be extinct for so long, and now they're one of the most common reptiles in the hobby.
Yeah, my favorite part about that little fun fact is they were just looking on the wrong island the whole time.
Hmm.
Like, somebody just somehow, somewhere did a typo, and they were looking on the wrong island. They were like, "Look, there's no crested geckos on the island. They guess they went extinct." And in reality, they were just next door.
And they were rediscovered when one fell through a window or something, like in a research facility. There was a big storm apparently, and it picked one up and it dropped it in like the lap of a researcher. And they're like, "This is a crested gecko. This is ciliatus. Like, why is this here?" And that's literally like the story of how they discovered it. Is it fell onto someone or it fell into a research area during a storm?
Yeah, that's hilarious. I didn't know that little
Yeah,
bit. I knew it was an accident. I knew they were on the other island for some other reason, and then somebody was like, "Wait, what? That's not supposed to be here."
yeah,
But I didn't
classic.
know that actually fell on like directly in the lap of scientists. That's funny.
Yeah.
All right, we'll move on to number two. What do you got, Alex?
So for my second one, I did. It used to be a very common and super common reptile in the hobby. It's become less so, but not because it's not a great beginner reptile. I'm not exactly sure why it's become less so, to be honest. But African fat-tailed geckos,
Oh, yeah.
and I'm not even gonna try and say that scientific name because I know that's just not gonna end well. Unless either of y'all would like to attempt it. um,
Let me see. I'll look it up real quick.
yeah,
Yeah, me too. Harrison's better at
it's
the fancy words than I am.
yeah, it's probably the hardest one of the three that I have.
Hemitheconyx uh, cotocinctus is what it looks like.
Looks
That was a good
sounds
one.
good to me.
Close enough.
And cautis, so cotocinctus would be like caudex tail because they have that big fat tail.
Yeah,
It's a reference to like a caudiciform, so it's a big fat like bulbous type of growth.
yeah, which is exactly what they have. Just like they and the other thing that they had always been like people back in the day used to think they were like a flip flop between was leopard geckos because they look very similar, different colored patterns, but like body and structure and everything they look very similar, but they are completely different care. The so like
Wildly
African,
different locations.
yeah, too. Like African fat-tailed geckos are found in West Africa and like Senegal and even northern Cameroon and Central Africa, but versus leopard geckos that are found in Iraq, Iran, and the Middle East. But like their basic care, they like a deep substrate and need a tank that's about 3 foot long, 18 deep, and they don't need the height as much because they are a ground dwelling gecko. Um, they like their basking spot between about 90 to 100, and their like average temp or cool side temp about 70 to 75. So they like a nice gradient between the sides of their tank, which is why you would need a little bit of a longer tank so it can be hotter and cooler, and get that nice gradient. The other thing with them, from what I did research on them, is that they need a wet and a dry season. So their like wet season was from like October or April to October, and during that time they between 60 to 80% humidity. And during their dry season, which is November to March, 50, right around 50 or a little bit lower, but they need that change in the seasons from what the research I did. And the feeding wise, again, they eat mostly, they're insectivores, so they eat things like crickets, dubia roaches, mealworms, superworms, things like that. Cons to them, I would say that they can be a little flighty sometimes when handling. Just depends like how used to the being handled the animal is, and then also the humidity and trying to do the different seasons. It's a little difficult.
Yeah, that's definitely an elevated challenge. A
Yes.
lot of people might not be prepared for. Like you'd have to probably. That's not something you can kind of figure out on your own. You probably have to do a lot of research to be able to simulate those kind of conditions.
Yeah.
Yeah, but also
Um,
depending on where you live too, like you might have a climate that kind of already has a rainy season, so just humidity could be potentially just elevated in general and then drop in general, like we were saying, kind of with crested gecko. But
That's
it's not. I don't think that's a deal breaking con at all. Like,
no, it just gives it a
but
little more
yeah, definitely
difficult.
something to think about. I always sleep on African fat tails. Like they are one that definitely goes under the radar and is super cool and really not all that hard. They kind of have the one hiccup with the slightly specialized humidity and seasonal needs, but
Hmm.
other than that, they're really cool and really underrated. Not something you see every day.
I've
Yeah,
always wanted one.
you've always wanted one.
Yeah, they to me they've always been this like I prefer like darker animals typically like increased melanin stuff.
Hmm.
They've always been like almost like a goth leopard gecko in my eyes, like just this really cool, dark, beautifully patterned animal that's a little bit more uncommon. So it has that hint of it's more exotic than the common, easy to care for gecko.
Yeah, and like that's part of why I put it on here because they are pretty easy to care for, but they're not super common. Um, but they did used to be like they used to be just as common as the leopard geckos like
Hmm.
what 10 years ago, but now I don't know why they've declined, probably because of the seasons and things like that with the humidity and stuff.
It could
Um,
be difficult to breed or something because of that.
yeah, that
I
it could
I
be.
think I remember reading about it a while ago. This isn't 100% fact, but I believe a lot of the ones that were coming in a while ago were wild caught imports, and
Mm,
Yes.
that kind of shut down a bit, and now it's a lot more captive bred. And since wild caught imports were so prevalent, not a ton of people were breeding them. And now that those are shut down, less people are breeding them, so they're just became a little more uncommon.
that makes sense.
Yeah, that
I think
definitely
I'm
makes sense.
pretty sure that's true. That's not. That's kind of just off the top
Well,
head, but I do
the import
remember
laws over
something
there.
about them.
Didn't something similar to that happen with the ball pythons, where a lot of them were imported back in the day, and now it's no longer the case. Like very aggressively, there are a ton of breeders out there, of course, but I thought it had something to do with import laws more so than the fact that there are so many people producing them in captivity.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think so.
because that happened with bearded dragons as well. Um, Small tangent here, don't worry, we'll get right back on task. But all the bearded dragons in captivity right now, the central bearded dragons, are all pretty closely related. And with the morphs and stuff, it's starting to bring up genetic issues. And it's because of the Australian import laws. You can't uh, export Pagona vidiceps anymore out of there. And so people are having to hybridize with Pagona barbata, another subspecies of bearded dragon, and in order to try to diversify those genes because it's been so long since we've had fresh genetics come into the captive populations that issues are starting to arise. So
Yeah,
import laws definitely change up the game in captivity.
yeah. Australia does a really good job of protecting their wildlife, but there are definitely some cons that come with it. You know.
Yeah, I mean they don't like Australia. I know, like the people there, they can't even keep anything that's not native. They don't allow it.
Yeah, and speaking of that, that takes me right into my second one. We're still staying in Australia, but we're not going the bearded dragon route. We are going the blue-tongued skink route.
Ooh.
Mm.
So blue-tongued skink, a few different species. They're all in the genus Taliqua. At the end of the day, all of Taliqua are about the same. And care-wise, at the very basics of it, of course, if you're considering getting one, look into the exact species that you're going to get and make those little tweaks to make sure that they're having the best possible care. But pros of them, dude, these things are like bulletproof. I've never seen a captive one mad. Of course, the wild's different, but never seen a captive one mad. They're really hardy, really just tough. That you can feel their skin. It's like almost armor plated. And again, just like the crested gecko, we don't necessarily need live feeders for this thing. Lots of prepared diets are very good. They're omnivorous, so they do need some sort of, you know, animal or bug-based food, but they also eat vegetables. Eating is not an issue with these things. They're not picky. They're just little garbage trucks. They eat anything. So that's super easy not to worry about. They're super tough, super handleable. Uh, but the cons, they do have a couple. They get big. Now, it could be a pro or a con because bigger means generally easier to handle, less risk. If you drop it, it's not as big of a deal. But
But the likelihood of you dropping it, considering their temperament, is like super, super low.
Yeah.
yeah,
That's important to
exactly.
know. I think Clint famously said it's like handling a potato.
Yeah, like literally, that's an awesome analogy. Uh, but they are awesome about that kind of stuff. Cons, though, since it is big, you need a big tank. I would say at least a 4 foot by 2 foot uh, floor space area. Height doesn't matter as much. Of course, a little bit's better than none, but just I'd mainly get that 4 by 2 is what I would say is about the minimum to keep them happy and healthy. Uh, Another thing is UV lighting. They do need UV lighting. I know back in the day they kind of said they didn't. New stuff's coming out. In my personal opinion, this is a diurnal animal that stays out during the day in Australia. They're getting exposed to UV. There's no way it's gonna be bad, but there is a if they don't have it, it could totally go bad. I say put UV and do your calcium supplements. There's no like I don't think there's two ways about that one. But unlike the bearded dragons, I think it is probably a little less important. So if you were to forget to change those lights at the end of the year, it's not as big of a deal as it would be with like a bearded dragon. So those couple little points are what put it ahead of the bearded dragon for me, and they're just pretty overall great pet lizards.
They're adorable.
Oh yeah, they're amazing lizards. I
This
will say the main ones in the hobby that I've seen for sale, they're not the Australian subspecies. They're the is it Indonesia, I believe, right?
or like
The Indos, yeah, popular too.
Yeah, those are like the main ones that I see, and like the main, really the only difference when you were talking about like care, they're basically the same. Really, the only difference is like the Indonesians need more humidity versus the Australians.
Yeah, definitely some small differences in there. Another cool thing about them is there's tons of morphs. The morphs are pretty pricey just because of how they don't breed in huge numbers. So, of course, you add in a morph to that, it's gonna be even less. But there's some really cool morphs out there. If you're cool with spending some money, you can get some that are, like, solid black. Really cool.
A lot of the natural morphs are actually really pretty as well. Like that's one of the main things I was going to bring up about that. There are multiple species or subspecies. I'm not super well versed on it, but they look fairly different from animal to animal, if I recall correctly.
Yeah,
Um,
that is definitely true. Since, like, Alex brought up the Indonesia ones, there's, like, some island populations, and they will shift in color depending on the region they live in. Some are more red and orange, and some are more kinda gray, brown. Depends where you go for. You can get a really beautiful animal that is pretty much any color you want.
Yeah, I think like you were saying, the morphs and everything, it makes it a really cool animal. Even like Harrison was saying, the natural morphs, because from what I've seen, the Indonesians tend to be a little bit darker, have more of that black, like that dark black, and like darker browns and stuff. But the Australians tend to have like yellows and reds in their
like
sides.
outback coloration.
Yeah, they have more of that color to them, but they're a really cool animal.
Yeah, I don't think anybody who's ever, like, worked with them a bit in person, like, held them, hates them. I don't think anybody's like, "Yeah, these are lame." I think everybody, even if they're not your absolute favorite having your collection, everybody's like, "Yeah, dude, I love blue tongues. They're great."
Oh
It's
yeah,
one of those animals where when you think of like what a pet should be, they're a perfect pet because they're just so chill and they're goofy and they don't really require too much. It's like this thing is a pet. That's what that is.
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely good pets. Only thing though is that space, so people who live in apartments or are relegated to only keeping reptiles in your bedroom or stuff, you it could run into some space issues, but again, 4 foot by 2 foot is not that big, especially if you get into, like, bioactive naturalistic vivariums, they actually make them look really good. We'll get deeper in that in future episodes, but you can have it be pretty like, look nice in your house.
yeah. Um, so I'm gonna go ahead and do my final one. Um, and my final of the top three that I picked, I wanted to do basically amphibian lizard, and I wanted to do a snake. I've never kept any snakes because I like living. Um, and my mother would make sure that ceased to happen if I brought one to this house. But one snake that is, it's not, it used to be a very common snake. You would see them at Petco, you'd see them at PetSmart and stuff like that all the time. They're less common now, but it's also actually a native to North America. Rosy boas. They're a super chill, super cool snake that come in some really cool colors, and they're pretty easy to care for.
Where are they native?
They're native to like California. You'll
Oh,
find
Arizona.
rosy boas. There's even not rosy boas, but same I think family. The rubber boas. They're all the way up, found up all the way up in Canada. Like the whole
holy!
West Coast has these kinds of rosy boas and things like that.
I did not know
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, we've
Yeah,
got really, really pretty ones down here in Arizona.
yeah.
They're black and white, they're awesome. I've never found one in the wild, but I follow some of the local herpers here, and when they find them, 'em, I'm so jealous, they're beautiful, and even in the wild, like, not to steal Alex's thunder here, but even in the wild here, those things are so chill, like, you see people just pick up wild ones responsibly, of course, don't just go touch animals without having any proper permits and stuff, but they're so chill. Like, they're even wild ones and wild when they're chill in the wild, you know they're chill in captivity.
That
Oh
makes
yeah.
so much sense. I have a buddy of mine who's breeding Smithy Eye or Gecko Smithy Eye. This is a Smith's green eyed gecko, but that's not important. But he was over, I believe, in Arizona or the Southwest somewhere, and he was posting pictures of him like catching these things in the wild. And I was so confused because for some reason I thought these were South American or Australian or something like that. And he was like, "Yeah, rubber boa in the wild." And I remember seeing those on like shows about like zoos and stuff, and being like, "What the hell is going on?" So that actually clears up a lot for me. Thank you.
Yeah, they're actually a really cool native. And like the rosy boas tend to be more like Southern California, Mexico, like the western states like that, like close to Mexico. Um, but like I said, there's rubber boas native to Canada.
It's
So I
wild.
mean, yeah, it's crazy how different they can be, all from the same. Like I'm pretty sure the same family. Not 100%. Don't quote me on that. But so getting into their care, rosy boas for like a smaller boa, because they do range in size too. So a smaller boa, they would say 2 foot long, 12 foot, or not 12 foot, 12 inches deep, 12 inches tall for a minimum, and that's like bare minimum, but minimum tank size for a smaller boa. For a larger one, I would say 4 foot, 2 foot, 2 foot.
When you're
Um,
saying smaller boa, are you saying like a juvenile or is a different species?
so rosy boas, from my research, they can like as adults can range in size.
Oh,
Um, and it could just be localities that haven't been fully described and things like that. Because, like I said, they have a pretty wide range. I mean, obviously,
right.
Arizona, California, Mexico, they're all over the place and all up the coast. Um, but like their actual adult size ranges from smaller to larger.
That's so interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they've definitely got that, like, exotic feel to them. They're very weird.
Yes.
Super cool, but
I'm gonna
Yeah,
look
and
at pictures.
yeah, and they have
interesting
that super
species.
cool natural pattern too. So like they're not just like a
Oh
solid
wow,
color snake.
these are cool.
Yeah. Um, and the other cool thing is, so they do need UVB. They're not UVB like a normal basking out in the sun, like a bearded dragon or things like that. They just need like a shade dweller UVB. So like Arcadia 6% shade dweller. So they're not super dependent on UVB. Um, and they surprisingly don't have like, even though living in Arizona and California and things like that, don't have like a super high hot spot or anything like that. For my research, their basking spot, they like it between 85 to 90. And on the cool side, they like it from 75 to 80. Um, Humidity, not a really a thing, or it is a thing. Anything less than 60%. They do not like going higher than that because they can get respiratory infections and things like that. Because I mean, they come from these arid climates. They're not in super humid places. Um, and so at night you can let it drop down to 60. Um, and that kind of goes into like one of the cons, I think, kind of with them, is that they do have a higher temp. Even like the basking spot's not super high, but like even their cool side's still in the 80s and like higher 70s, which is can be a little bit harder in some people's homes um to do without trying to do heat all throughout it and things like that. Um, and then their diet, which some people's a con because they don't like feeding rodents and things like that, but they mainly eat rodents. They'll eat quail chicks and things like that as well. But a lot of people don't like feeding that, so I kind of can see that as kind of a con to try and get into them.
Yeah, I kinda think of them as, like, a slightly different version of a sand boa.
I
If
was
you were
gonna.
to Yeah, if you were to be interested in sand boas, you know, looking up best pet snake, sand boa will be on every list. They're very similar, but a little different. They're out a little more often, you'll see it a little more,
Less
but they are a
girthy.
little harder to find, but still, like,
I'm looking
that's
at.
how I would think of them, my closest, like, hair-wise relative.
I'm looking at pictures of them right now, and they do look like a combination of like a Kenyan sand boa and like a boa constrictor. Basically, they have like a stripe, like a set or a set of stripes that runs the length of their body. So they've got this like coloration like a sand boa, and they've got that wide neck like a sand boa, where their head isn't like super angular, but they still have more of a hint of that angular head than a sand boa typically does.
Yeah, and their eyes aren't like on top of their head like the Sambo. They don't
Yeah,
look as derpy. Um,
the
but
horse from
yeah,
Family Guy.
yeah. But I mean they come in crazy colors. Like I mean just their natural colors are like oranges and grays, which for a lot of species you don't find that kind of coloration just natural.
Hmm. The black and white one is beautiful.
Yeah, that's the other things. They range in their natural coloration because black and white is completely natural, but same as the orange and gray, like they can range in their coloration from the two.
Hmm.
Which, like I said, that might be different localities that just haven't been separated in science yet. Sciences, localities and things like that are always changing.
Oh, there's like a black and blue one. That is awesome. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
they're
these are really cool.
super cool snakes. Very underrated. I'm happy you had brought those up in there. I
Yeah,
didn't
Yeah,
and
think
they
they
sure.
were
used to be
well here.
super common. Like you used to never be able to go to a Petco or PetSmart without seeing a rosy boa. At least from my experience, every time I went to a Petco, especially Petco, they had rosy boas.
Mhm.
I think it's probably export laws again.
It could be that. It could
I bet a
also
lot of those are wild caught.
that too. And then also just boas in general. A lot of times, unless they're like the big boas, a lot of people aren't like super into them. So I feel like a lot of people don't realize that they're there, and there just wasn't as many breeders for them. Just kind of like how we were talking about earlier with. I'm blanking on what we were talking about when we said it, but there's just not as many breeders for them.
Yeah.
Oh, oh yeah, I think it was the ball pythons or something like that. We were talking about how there were a lot of breeders, and so they stopped importing them or something along the lines of that. But yeah.
Yeah. But back on the ball pythons, that is my last one. Ball
Ah,
python or Python regius. I know um, us in this chat, we're not ultra into the ball pythons. I do think the market is oversaturated with them. But kind of like the blue tongue skink, it is hard to beat them if you're looking for a pet. If you're looking for something you can hold and it's pretty easy to care for, it's hard to beat them. It really is. They are not a very large snake. A big female's like 5 foot long, which is not too huge, really. Um, they are miskept, I think, a lot. I think a lot of people shove them in those little racks where they can barely move, and that's not ideal. I want my snakes to be able to stretch out. So I say the bigger the better uh, on those guys. I'm not going to give an exact size on these ones just because there's a
it's
ton of
so
information.
controversial.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I
so
mean,
controversial.
I will
not
say, I'll be the guy to say the controversial thing. The tubs are bad. They did a study about what happens when you give one of the ball pythons stimulation, like an environmental stimulation. So a lot of people will say they're burrowing animals. They don't need trees in the wild. They don't use them. So there's no point in doing that. Every single snake that these people put in an enclosure that had some kind of branches utilized those branches, and it had something to do with misconceptions about the locales. Like the original imported ones, people were saying, oh, there's no trees in their native range and they're only burrowers, so it's a waste of space. But all of those snakes utilized those branch systems, and that's enrichment for your animal.
yeah,
um,
Yeah, and
that's
you
something I
gotta
was going
also
to say.
consider, like, your if nature is a lot different than in your house. If they're stuck in this little box, they're way more likely to be like, "You know what? I'm normally not a tree kinda guy, but I'm a little bored today, I'll climb a tree for fun."
right.
Oh
Right?
yeah,
We
Like,
probably
it
shouldn't get
is different.
too far down this rabbit hole.
Yeah, we're gonna have, like, a 10 episode series about this.
yeah. That was one thing
Uh,
I was going to say too. Is I mean, even if there isn't trees, they still people don't realize in a box you're not. It's not a tree. It's not 10 feet in the air. You're 2 feet up. That's a bush. I mean, they will climb those in the wild.
And they
yeah,
hunted.
exactly.
Yeah,
Uh,
they do.
but back to their care. Again, go bigger rather than smaller on housing. Temperatures, I would put a heat pad under there just to give them a bit of a gradient. Again, another pro to bigger tank, bigger gradients. Go maybe about 90, 95 on the hot side, and then about 75 to 80 on the cool side. That'll do you pretty good. They're pretty tough snakes. Um, Humidity, again, pretty middle of the road. Lower, I would say, is better than too high because they will get respiratory infections, but they need a little bit of water in there or they will start having bad sheds and stuff. They definitely need a little bit, but I would stray more to drier than hotter. They are native to Africa, not known for being super, super wet where they live. And then last thing really is just that handling. They are not prone to striking, especially if you keep them in an environment where they feel comfortable and they're not like constant. Like that is a thing I've also seen with tubs. The lot of snakes kept in tubs. you open that tub up and they freak out because they're going from total darkness and not moving, and then you grab the tub, now the whole world's moving and it's really bright. That's scary. Like they're gonna get a little spooked.
Yeah, and I will say one other thing too that's good about them. Um, there's a morph out there for everybody. I mean,
Mm.
they have thousands of morphs. It's insane.
And they're
And
making more every day.
yeah, they're making new
Oh yeah,
ones every day. So there is a morph out there for everybody. If you don't like the normals, you're gonna find one you like.
yeah. It's almost a meme in the community that everybody's produced a world's first ball python.
Yeah.
Like, they there are so many morphs and colors. You will find one you like, even if they're not your total dream favorite snake. You'll find one that looks pretty close to it.
That's
Yeah.
true.
So I think they're awesome as far as pets go. Again, this is a pet. This is something that you can hold pretty much every day, and it's really not going to care. So we'll do a quick recap of everything we had on our list, and then we've got one honorable mention each, and we'll talk about that. So first up, I had crested geckos. Again, smaller species, still super handleable, doesn't need live food, and the only issue is kind of humidity is a little tricky sometimes, and potentially temperature, depending where you live. Second, I had blue tongue skink. Nobody's going to argue they're not an amazing pet. Now, the issues with them is size. They're pretty big. They're going to take up a little bit of real estate in your home,
I would
and
say
the
cost
light.
as well.
Oh, yeah, did I say pro? I meant con. Con is they're going to take up a little bit of real estate in your home.
I was just saying I would say one more con is they are not cheap animals.
No.
Yeah, definitely not cheap. Expect to pay a couple $100s for one.
And their diet is very varied, but it's very different than most animals people keep because it's not really so much crickets and things like that. It's veggies, fruits, but also things people feed dog food to them and things like that. So it's a little,
Odd.
yeah, it's a little
Yeah,
odd.
definitely out there. I don't think I've ever seen one refuse a meal,
No,
no matter what it was. And then final one on my list, again, these are in no particular order. They're all gonna fit each individual's needs, was the good old ball python. And then that was my top 3. I think one of those will fit every person for the most part.
yeah, my top three as a recap was first white tree frogs. Pros, they're very handleable for an amphibian. They will eat anything that fits in their mouth, insect wise. Um, they are normally out and about. Cons, I would say, they are a bigger, heavy-bodied frog. So if you're wanting to keep them with a bunch of tropical plants, they're probably going to crush some. Um,
Yep.
and when they call, it is loud. They have a very loud call. I can say from experience because mine has called every night for the past week. Um, they don't tend to call at night as much, though. I will say that, at least with my experience. Um, but other than that, again, very handleable. They do very well in even simple enclosures, and they'll eat just about anything. Second one was African fat-tailed geckos. Again, a great beginner. Good for handling once you've gotten used to them. They've gotten used to you holding them and things like that. They can be a little flighty sometimes if they're not fully used to being held. Um, and then also the season changing with the humidity and things like that. It can be a little difficult to get that pretty accurate to the months it's supposed to be and things like that. Um, but it's not super bad. Again, very easy. There is a couple of morphs out there, not a ton. And then my last one being a rosy boa, which again, just an underappreciated reptile that is super easy to care for. Um,
And
again, yeah, and native. Like it's not something you see every day, and it's something that is native to the U.S., which you don't find a ton of those in the hobby either. At least not readily available. And then other cons with them being that it has to be a little bit warmer in their environment and that gradient. They like it warmer, even on their cooler side. And also feeding mice or quail. Not everybody is comfortable with that. But Shaw, what's your honorable mention? Since we'll get into that.
So my honorable mention isn't an exact species. It's a whole group of animals that, if your living conditions provide space for this, they are without a doubt the best pet reptile ever. But most people can't accommodate for them, and it is chelonians, shelled reptiles, turtles and tortoises.
Mm,
If you have a yard in a climate that is permissive to whatever species you're looking for, you can just let a tortoise loose out there, and it's just like a having like a little dog out there. They'll just run around, they eat veggies, no live food. They're awesome. I love them. No special lighting, no special heating, depending on where you live. Of course, different species are going to be different. Some places you might have to take them in for the winter, some you might have to take them in for the summer. Here it's both of them. You got to have a winter and summer house for most tortoise species. And some aren't great here because of humidity. It's really dry. But turtles, on the other hand, they're red ear slider turtle. That bad boy can live in all 50 states outside all year, maybe except Alaska. You might need to put a defroster in there for them, and that's it. Those dudes are bulletproof, and they're awesome. I love mine. I've had my main red ear slider, very first one I ever had, first reptile. I've had her for 15 years now. I kept her inside for the first good few years of her life just because that was just how it was, you know? And then when I moved, when I was 14 into the house I'm currently living at, I decided to move her outside. I was like, "You know what? I've got a little space now. I'm gonna move her outside." And so much happier and healthier, and I love caring for her way more. When she was in a tank, it was hard, man. She would get that thing dirty in 2 seconds. It always looked ugly because no matter how you try to decorate it, they will destroy it. Now she's outside, dude, awesome, I love it, and I now have 8 turtles. They are the easiest reptiles I have. I love them. 'Em, they're so interactive, they eat mostly pellet food. You cannot beat them if your living conditions provide for it, and that means you're gonna have to do some research to find an exact species that's perfect for you, but if you can have an outdoor enclosure, dude, get yourself a shelled reptile or a chelonian.
Yeah, I would say those are also very good reptiles. The only other con that I would add on to that is how long they live. Because
yes.
most people will furniture and stuff to their children. You will be willing a tortoise to your child. Um,
Yep,
because
no, that's
almost every
exactly how it is.
species will outlive you.
Yep, it's a big joke here because, we have a lot of sulcata tortoises here, they do very well. So a lot of people have them in their backyard, and it's a very common joke to hear around my area is, "The tortoise is in the will because he's gonna outlive me." And like I said, I've had my red ear slider for 15 years. She's still laying eggs. I have a male with her, and I now freeze the eggs because there are definitely too many red ear sliders in the hobby. But dude, she's still laying eggs. You'd think she was 2 years old with how she acts. She's got a long time left with me. One of my other favorite fun facts about him is Sylvester Stallone has, I believe still to this day, has the turtles from the Rocky movie. He kept the ones that were on set and still has them. So they will live a long time, which is a pro and a con. I love that I've had my turtle since she's been with me my whole life. Like, we're tight, we're best friends, and some people that can be a con, but I like it.
One of the really cool things about that is that if you're interested in rescuing reptiles or rescuing animals in general, because they do live so long, people often do find themselves in situations where they may not be able to care for one anymore. So if you're looking for an animal to rescue, look for a turtle or a tortoise.
Yeah,
Probably going
they're
to
Yeah,
give it a
that's
great
how
home.
I got most of mine. Most of mine came from bad environments, deformed shells, and now they're living out their best lives and a lot happier, and I think I paid for let's see, I paid for 1 turtle in my life, and I have 8. So,
Buy turtles.
yeah, it just happens, and I can't say no to a rescue.
Right. Yeah.
yeah. I will say the only other thing is like certain states, like I know here in NC, um, if they're under a certain size, you cannot buy them. They are illegal to sell because of salmonella, which we're not going to get into that because that's a whole tangent.
The rule
Um,
is I do know this one actually, because I did have to deal with potentially shipping and selling turtles at some point. Like I said, she lays eggs. I've had babies before.
mhm,
U.S. native turtles, 4 inches. If they're under 4 inches, you can't sell them. But really, it's a very weird law that isn't enforced in all that too much. It's very weird because some of our native species don't even really get 4 inches, and some do. And I've never seen an issue with it if they're shipped. It's only in person. 'Cause it's also for like poaching. So it is funky laws on the U.S. native stuff for the most part. Just get a rescue, man. Don't have to worry
yeah,
about any of that if it's a rescue.
yeah.
True.
Now I'll get into my honorable mention, which it is a specific species and is a species that I keep. It's not a common species. I think they're starting to pick up a little bit in the hobby. Because they are now a what you would call pet smart species because you can get them there, and I'm now seeing them there regularly. But they are not a super common species, and that would be my Cuban false chameleon or bearded anole or Anoleus barbatus. Um, and they are a pretty easy species to keep. You just have to have heat, UVB. They don't need super high heat. They just need like a basking spot of like 80 to 90. They're really not hard to keep, but a lot of things that people run into are they can get dehydrated very quickly. You have to miss them, and they like multiple times a day because they don't realize a water bowl is a water bowl most of the time, unless you have like a dripper or something like that on there. Because there's tons, I've seen tons and tons of stories of people who are like, "There's water in there, but it died, and it's because it was dehydrated. It didn't realize there was water in that bowl." And the other thing is too, especially with mine specifically, they are not a they're not like a super reactive feeder. And when I say that, I mean I'll throw crickets in there, and I know she's eating because she's defecating. I've tried to tongue feed her, and she will very slowly eat maybe one or two, and that's it. Um, they are not a big. They are more, especially the species. They are mostly a let me sit here and wait until something comes by. Because in the wild, they actually eat snails, which I find really cool. And I haven't tried to feed her snails yet. I want to because I think it would be really cool. But
Yep, that's
um,
definitely cool. The thing I do like about having those in your honorable mention is a lot of the issues with them can be solved with auto misters and timers and stuff. It's
yeah,
definitely upfront cost. That setup is gonna cost you some money, but if you're cool with that, now it's basically a bearded dragon that lives in a tree. Just
yeah. And the other thing too with them is another, I guess, con I would say is for an anole species, they are very large for an anole species. Um, Mine, she's probably, I would say, upwards of 10 inches from tip of nose to tip of tail. So she is currently in a 2 foot, 2 foot, 18-inch deep tank. And that is like bare minimum, I would say, because everywhere you do research, it's flip flops between 2 foot tall and 3 foot tall. They will use that height. They are an arboreal species. I do see mine on the ground every now and again. She actually will sleep on the ground a lot. Um, but they do need a taller, like a much taller enclosure that a lot of people can't find super easily, or they're really expensive. Um, as well as they need good coverage for like plants and things like that. Like mine's fully bioactive, so there's lots of plants, there's palms, all that kind of stuff to cover her. But they can stress because they are a secretive species. They don't like to be out in the open, um, and just be like, "Hey, look at me." No, I walk in the room, I can see that she's watching me the entire time I'm in the room because she does not fully trust me. One other thing, though, I will say that's actually really cool about them is their mouths, when they open it up, it is jet black inside.
That's cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
their tongue is black, their mouth is black. It's actually really cool. But they, again, and they also have a sticky tongue like a bearded dragon would. Or,
Chameleon or something.
yeah, which they're called the false chameleon because they have the independent moving eyes like a chameleon. And for years and years and years, they were actually believed to be chameleons. They did not realize they were a null species.
Yeah, they're definitely a good alternative if you're like, "I think chameleons are super cool lizards." Then you look into their care and you're like, "Whoa, that's intense."
Yeah,
But
Complicated.
grab that,
yeah,
and a lot of that intensity gets cut down with a lot of the same cool features about them.
Yeah,
oh yeah,
and they have such great personalities. When I worked at the Amphibian Foundation, we had a group of like 4 or 5 fairly young ones, and every time I opened that enclosure up, they would jump out and jump onto you while you were like trying to clean their enclosure or feed them. They're very curious. In some cases, of course, if it's I believe yours was an adult when you got it, so it's still warming up to you and all that kind of stuff. And you never know what they've been through, but
yeah,
um, in a lot of cases, they are fairly personable and fairly curious.
yeah. Mine was a full-grown female that I had gotten at a PetSmart. Because they were talking. I'd been wanting one for a while, anyways, and I saw one, and she was very large for the enclosure they had her in a PetSmart, and I felt bad for that already. And then they were telling me about how she'd been there for over a year because they're not cheap lizards either, or at least not for a lizard. Because PetSmart is probably the cheapest spot you can find them, but most of the time, a little baby's $150 minimum.
Mm.
Um, and they're not a very prevalent breeder because they're a null species. They lay like 1 to 2 eggs per laying.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. That's probably their biggest con, and really probably why they're not on the top 3 list is their upfront costs are a good bit. You know,
yes.
you're not
So hard to get.
yeah, like,
Yeah.
it's kinda hard to get one and then get one in a proper enclosure, but once you do, pretty sweet.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, they're
but
awesome.
I think it's a pretty good wrap, we've had some pretty good discussion so far. Anything else any of you guys wanna add on to, like,
Two
any
things.
final comments?
You were saying it can be challenging to find larger arboreal enclosures, and I cannot stress how annoying that is. Like in
Yeah.
actuality, like if you go to reptile shows, they don't carry 3 foot by 3 foot enclosures almost ever. Like the biggest I can ever find is like a 3 foot tall by 18 by 18, which is a great size for your larger species of gecko and your arboreal frogs. Bigger would be better, especially if you're keeping frogs in a group or something like that. But when you go to a show, there's like 1 or 2 of those enclosures, and they sell so fast. So it's really challenging sometimes to find nice, big enclosures for specifically arboreal animals. Um,
Yeah, and, I mean, even, like, the 4 by 2s, like, a lot of those are a lot more available now with a lot of the ship's flat, like, PVC companies.
mhm.
So, things like for that blue tongue skink, pretty much half the animals we talked about today. Even those, I don't always fully trust. I have one that I'm working on for my bearded dragon right now, but, like, you're gonna want to seal it up. Sourcing bigger enclosures can be a bit annoying. That is definitely for sure, uh,
Right.
an issue.
Yeah.
So and then, before I cut you off, you were getting on to your other point. What was that one gonna be?
Oh, I wanted to say that as a testament to both of y'all's lists, I have one species in my collection from each list. I keep white tree frogs. I believe Alex does as well.
Yes.
Uh, and I also have a crested gecko. Um, so the number one species from both of y'all's or not the number one in terms of ranking, but the first one y'all both mentioned, I have both, and I can absolutely agree with the choice of those.
Yeah, I also have both.
Yeah, I've definitely either kept or worked fairly closely with a lot with all the species on my list, like, I've never kept blue tongue skinks, but there was a time when I was gonna get into breeding them, and so I did a ton of research. I've been around a lot of them, and same thing with ball pythons. Like I've been around so many of them, and I crested geckos I've kept, and like I wanted stuff I've had some personal experience with and really seen, and had friends who have kept, and so it's not just like in theory these are the best. That I wanted something that I really do agree with being the
Right.
best.
Right. That's good.
Yeah.
All right,
Nice.
so that was episode 2, our top 3, and anywhere we can find you, Harrison. Where can
Oh,
we all keep up
um,
with you, what you're working on? Because you definitely have some good points in here, and this wasn't even a full interview. We've got more episodes coming with him about like a little more in-depth stuff that he's really into. It's super cool stuff he's working on. You guys should follow him and keep up. It's good stuff.
probably just my Instagram. HDO Nature Designer is my Instagram because I do nature design based stuff. HDO are just my initials. My name's Harrison Ormson. Oh, and I have a YouTube channel. I totally forgot about that. Um, I think it has the same title. I think it's Orms. It's either Ormson Nature. I think it's Ormson Nature Design. How do I not know my own YouTube channel? But if you
Should have
look up
known you were
my
coming
name,
on here. Get all your stuff to pimp.
yeah, I'm disorganized. I'm so sorry. I'm a horrible guest.
Yeah,
Uh,
we'll just fire you. It was terrible. You didn't
I
contribute
apologize for
anything at all. No,
y'all.
it was very nice having you on. It was good.
Yeah.
Uh, Definitely contributed a lot. Happy you were here. Um,
Yes.
Same thing for us. Remember, we're gonna link our Instagrams in the bio of this podcast right here. Follow us there. Remember, the podcast Instagram is where we're doing all of our most in tune stuff with the community, and we will see you next time.
Yeah. And again, everyone's Instagram and YouTube's will be linked in the bio. Um, Hope y'all have a great night, day, morning, wherever you're listening to this. And we'll see y'all next week.